For a generation of British children, Airfix meant the smell of glue, and the small grey Spitfire hung from the bedroom ceiling on a thread of cotton. At its peak, the company made 20 million kits a year, held 3/4 of the British market, and turned out as many as 17 new models in a single year. It had survived everything. The war, when its rubber went to the front, and it turned instead to moulding combs. The lean years of austerity and rationing, the rise of cheaper rivals at home and abroad. Airfix came through all of it. And then, after more than 40 years, the most famous name in British model making simply went silent. How does a company that survived a world war and outlasted nearly every rival it ever had just disappear? What happened inside those walls? Chapter 1. The man who was never interested in aeroplanes. The story begins, as these stories so often do, with a man who arrived in Britain carrying almost nothing, and a gift for making useful things out of the century's wreckage. It's 1939, London. And in a modest workshop, a Hungarian refugee with a quick temper and quicker instincts is about to found a company whose name will one day mean, to a whole generation of British boys, the smell of glue, the fiddle of a transfer sliding off into a saucer of water, and the small grey shape of a Spitfire hung on cotton from a bedroom ceiling. His name was Nicholas Cole, although that wasn't quite the name he was born with, and the man himself was only ever about half the story he told. He'd been born Miklos Klein in 1891, in the village of Anarx, out in the flat far east of Hungary. What happened to him next reads less like a business biography than an adventure serial. He became a cavalry officer in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War. He was captured by the Russians. He was interned somewhere out near the Korean border, about as far from home as a European could be sent, and then he escaped, across Siberia, on foot and by whatever else he could find, sheltered along the way by Catholic priests, taking 4 months to get back to what was left of his world. That would be enough for most men. It was barely the beginning for Kove. When he got home, he took a post as an assistant minister in Bela Kun's Hungarian Soviet Republic, the short-lived communist government that ruled Hungary for a few chaotic months in 1919. When it fell, a former communist official with an inconvenient past did the sensible thing. He left. What followed was a slow westward drift across the plastics trade of interwar Europe, Algiers in 1922, then Barcelona in 1934, where he set up a small plastics factory. When the Spanish Civil War came for him too, he fled again, to Milan in 1936, where he patented a stiffener for shirt collars and gave it the brisk, faintly absurd trade name Interfix. And then, in the autumn of 1938, with another war gathering, he crossed one more border. This time to London. He was 47 years old. He had a talent for injection moulding, a habit of chasing lapsed patents, and, by every account, a temper that could clear a room. And in 1939, he founded a company called Airfix Products. Here is the first thing to understand about Airfix, and it is a small, delicious irony that sits underneath the entire story. The most aeroplane-associated brand in British history was never named for aeroplanes at all. Cove's first products were air-filled rubber toys, inflatables. So the air in Airfix was the air he fixed inside them, and the fix, that was the plastic. As for why it began with an A, that was pure Cove. He believed a company name should sit at the very top of the trade directories, where a buyer's finger landed first. Airfix, alphabetically unbeatable. It was a hustler's instinct, and it turned out to be a stroke of accidental genius, because it put the name in front of everyone before anyone knew what it meant. Then the war came and rubber was requisitioned for the war effort. A lesser man might have folded. Covey pivoted, the way he always pivoted, sideways, fast, and into whatever material the moment left lying around. By 1947, he had introduced what was reputedly Britain's first injection moulding machine and turned Airfix into the largest manufacturer of plastic combs in the country. Combs, millions of them, in every colour a wartime dye could manage, moulded and trimmed and packed while the bombs still fell on London. For a time, he was even a major supplier of dye-stamped metal belt buckles to the War Office. Combs and buckles. That was the empire so far. Nobody watching would have guessed what it was about to become. And this is the texture of post-war Britain that the company grew up inside. A country of rationing and shortage and make-do, where a household kept everything and threw away nothing, and where a man who could turn cheap raw material into something people needed had a genuine future. Cove had lived through more collapses than most men see in 3 lifetimes. He knew in his bones how to build something out of very little in a place that had almost nothing. Cove himself was, in the words of one man who knew the trade, something of a rum old cove. Restless, volatile, forever chasing the next idea before the last one had settled, forever circling lapsed patents to see what he could pick up cheap. His own bank reportedly came to regard him as a liability to his own business, a man whose instinct for the new outran his patience for the profitable. After a cancer operation in 1950, aging and unwell, he took on an assistant manager, a young man who would matter enormously to what came next. But that's getting ahead of the story, because a year earlier, in 1949, Airfix had received a small, unglamorous commission that would change everything, and nobody involved had the faintest idea. Chapter 2. A Bag of Loose Parts. The commission came from Harry Ferguson, the Ulster engineer whose little grey tractors were quietly transforming British farming. Ferguson wanted a promotional model of his TE20 tractor, something a salesman could hand across a farmhouse kitchen table to close a deal. A small, precise replica of the real machine in about 1/20th scale. Airfix made it. And it was beautiful. And it was, from a business point of view, a disaster. The problem was assembly. The little tractors were moulded, first in cellulose acetate before polystyrene took over, and then had to be put together by hand, largely by the women on Cove's factory floor, part by fiddly part, each tiny wheel and axle and steering column fixed in place before the model could go out. It took time. Time cost money, and Ferguson wanted them cheap, and he wanted them by the thousand, to press into the hands of farmers across the country. The sums simply wouldn't work. Every finished tractor cost more in labour than the whole exercise could bear. So somebody at Airfix had an idea that was really an admission of defeat. If assembling the tractors was the expensive bit, then don't assemble them. Sell the parts loose, in a bag, and let the customer do the work. Turn the problem into the product. Let the buyer supply the labour that Airfix couldn't afford, and call it fun. That was it. That was the whole invention. The most successful hobby product in British history was born not from a flash of creative vision, but from a refusal to pay for labour. The construction kit, as Britain would come to know it, arrived by accident, sideways, as a cost-cutting measure on a tractor giveaway. And the customers loved it. There was something in the doing, the small satisfaction of a thing taking shape under your own hands, that the finished model could never give. Cove, being Cove, noticed the money before he noticed the magic. If people would happily assemble a tractor, what else might they assemble? The answer arrived in 1952, and it wasn't a tractor, it was a ship. The Golden Hind, Francis Drake's galleon, all rigging and romance, became the first true Airfix construction kit designed and sold as a kit from the start. And it very nearly didn't happen the way it did, because of a single hard-nosed man behind a desk at Woolworths. Woolworths was the key that unlocked everything. It was where ordinary British families actually shopped, on ordinary British high streets, with ordinary pocket money. Airfix proposed selling the Golden Hind boxed at around 5 shillings. The Woolworths buyer took one look and refused. 2 shillings, he said. Not a penny more. 2 bob was what a child could be trusted to bring to the counter, and 2 bob was the price. 5 shillings worth of kit for 2 shillings was impossible, unless you stripped out every cost you could find. And so the men at Airfix stripped out the most expensive thing of all, the box. Instead of a printed carton, the parts went into a transparent polythene bag, stapled to a folded paper header card, with the instructions tucked inside where the buyer could see exactly what he was getting through the plastic. Cheap to make, cheap to ship, cheap to hang on a rack. The 2 bob bagged kit was born, and with it something far bigger than a single toy, a mass market. Pocket money modelling, a hobby a working-class child could actually afford, with the coins in his own pocket, hanging at eye level in a shop his mother already visited every week of her life. That was the genius of the Woolworths partnership, and it's easy to miss now how radical it was. Airfix didn't chase the specialist hobby shops, the rarefied world of the serious enthusiast. It went where the children already were. It put a scale model of a Tudor galleon within reach of a boy who had never owned anything he'd built himself, and it charged him what he could actually pay. The buyer, who insisted on 2 shillings, a Woolworths man named Jim Russon, who would go on to suggest subjects for the kits himself, hadn't been trying to help Airfix. He'd been driving a hard bargain. But that hard bargain forced the invention that made the whole business possible. The man increasingly making these decisions was that assistant manager Cove had taken on in 1950, Ralph Ehrman, and Ehrman's own story rhymed with his employer's in a way that would prove almost unbearably poignant given what Airfix was about to sell. He was a German Jewish refugee. He had served as a navigator in the Royal Air Force. He had, in other words, flown in the very war that Airfix would spend the next 30 years turning into small grey plastic. Working alongside him was a general manager named John Gray, who understood something Cove was slow to grasp, that the future of the company wasn't in ships or tractors at all. It was in the air. Chapter 3. The aeroplane he didn't believe in. The aircraft kit that made Airfix was the Supermarine Spitfire. It appeared in 1953, or 1955, depending on which surviving record you trust, for even Airfix's own history is a little vague on the exact date. What isn't vague is what it meant, and it almost never happened because Nicholas Cove didn't believe in it. The story that survives is that when the Spitfire was proposed, Cove flatly refused to accept that a model aeroplane would sell. He'd built his fortune on combs and inflatables and galleons. Aircraft struck him as a niche too far. He was so unconvinced that he reportedly threatened to charge the cost of the tooling, the expensive steel molds, back to the very designers who wanted to make it. The founder of the company most synonymous with model aircraft had to be dragged, grumbling, into making one at all. He was wrong, of course, spectacularly, historically wrong, because for a British boy in the 1950s, the Spitfire was not a toy. It was the war his father had fought and his grandfather had lived through, made small enough to hold in 2 hands. This was a country barely a decade past the fighting, where the men on every street had a war behind them and mostly didn't speak of it, where bomb sites were still weeds and rubble at the end of ordinary roads. And here was a way in. Ehrman understood this instinctively, perhaps better than anyone alive could have, because he had sat in the back of RAF aircraft himself. A boy who asked his dad about the war could now be shown, rather than told. Here is the aeroplane that won the Battle of Britain. Here is what it looked like. Build it yourself and understand. The Spitfire sold, and then the Hurricane sold, and then the great Lancaster bomber. And Airfix had found the vein of gold it would mine for a generation, not plastic, but memory. The first Spitfire kit wasn't perfect. It carried squadron codes that were simply wrong, and it prompted a stream of complaint letters from the sort of enthusiast who noticed such things. One of those letter writers was a modeler named John Edwards, whose eye for accuracy was so sharp that Airfix did the only sensible thing and hired him. He became their chief designer, and he improved everything he touched. Until his death, far too young, at 38. But the true masterstroke wasn't any single kit. It was a decision about numbers that most people never consciously noticed, and every child absorbed without knowing it. Constant scale. Airfix decided that its aircraft would all be built to the same ratio, 1/72nd of real size. Every aircraft. A tiny Tiger Moth biplane and a great 4-engined Lancaster bomber sitting side by side on a bedroom shelf in correct proportion to one another. Rivals scaled their models to fit whatever box they happened to have, so a fighter might end up looking bigger than a bomber. Airfix refused, and that discipline turned buying kits into collecting them. A child didn't want one aeroplane. He wanted the squadron. He wanted the whole war, to scale, on his shelf. It was a marketing decision disguised as a matter of principle, and it was worth a fortune. Covey lived just long enough to see his accidental empire become a public company at the close of the 1950s. He died on the 17th of March 1958, 3 weeks after his wife. He left Airfix to his daughter Margaret, whom Ehrman then gently persuaded to retire to the south of France, leaving the company in the hands of the men who actually ran it. In 1959, Ralph Ehrman became chairman. The refugee navigator now ran the firm that sold the war back to Britain as a hobby. Under Ehrman, the company hardened into dominance, and it saw off its rivals one by one. There was Frog, which, awkwardly for Airfix, had actually invented the British plastic construction kit back in 1936 with a range it called Penguin. Frog had got there first, years before that accidental Ferguson tractor. But being first is not the same as being cheapest, or most available, or most beloved, and Frog never recovered the ground. By the late 1970s, it had collapsed entirely, its molds crated up and shipped off to the Soviet Union, where they were reborn, strangely, under the name Novo. There was Matchbox, which launched its own kits in 1973 with clever coloured plastic that needed no paint at all. A genuine threat, aimed squarely at the child who couldn't be bothered with Humbrol enamel. American firms like Revell and Monogram and Japanese firms like Tamiya were formidable, some of them technically superior. But at home, in Britain, none of them could touch Airfix. Not on price, not on range, and above all, not on that Woolworths rack, where the bagged kits hung within reach of every child in the country, in every high street, week after week after week. By the early 1960s, Airfix had bought the Kitmaster model railway range and folded it into the empire, extending its reach from the sky down onto the tracks. The catalogue grew and grew. The empire wasn't just growing anymore. It was becoming the landscape, the thing a British childhood was simply built against, as fixed and familiar as the Woolworths pick and mix a few counters along. Chapter 4. The Kingdom of Hot Polystyrene. To understand what Airfix was at its height, you have to walk into the factory, and the smell reaches you first. The main site was at Haldane Place, in Wandsworth, in southwest London, the headquarters and much of the production under one roof, down near the river at Earlsfield, with the plastics operation over at Windmill Road in Sunbury-on-Thames, and the whole place ran on polystyrene, which is to say, it ran on oil, because polystyrene is an oil derivative, an accident of chemistry that seemed like nothing at all in the cheap energy years, and would one day tighten around the company's neck like a noose. Raw plastic arrived as tiny granules, sacks of them, poured into hoppers above the moulding machines. There it was heated until it flowed like thick, colourless syrup, and then injected under enormous pressure into the closed steel moulds, where it filled every cavity and cooled and hardened in a matter of seconds into wings and fuselages and gun turrets and undercarriage legs. The machines worked in a steady mechanical rhythm. Close, inject, cool, open, eject, and again. Hour after hour, shift after shift. And over all of it hung that particular warm, faintly sweet chemical smell of hot polystyrene, a smell that anyone who worked there could summon in complete detail decades later, because it was the smell of their working life. The heart of it all, though, wasn't the moulding hall. It was the tool room, because before a single kit could be made, before a granule was ever melted, someone had to cut the mould, and this was the most demanding, the most secret, and by a distance, the most expensive work Airfix did. A skilled toolmaker took a block of hardened steel and, over weeks of patient labour, cut into it the exact negative of every part, every panel line, every raised rivet, every subtle compound curve of a cockpit canopy, all of it reversed and hollowed into metal to a tolerance finer than a human hair. Where the finished plastic would show a fine engraved line, the steel had to carry a fine raised ridge, machined and hand-finished, and checked again. A single set of moulds for one aircraft could cost more than a suburban house. Get it wrong, misjudge a shrinkage, misplace a line, and you had scrapped a fortune in steel. These men were the true aristocracy of the factory floor. Quiet, exacting, close to irreplaceable, the sort of craftsman a company only realizes it depended on once they're gone. Every Spitfire a child ever built began as a shape inside a toolmaker's imagination and a block of steel under his hands. From the moulding machines, the parts came out on frames. The sprues, that grey plastic lattice every modeller who ever lived remembers snapping their pieces away from, and the little scars it left where you snapped too hard. The frames were inspected for short shots and flaws, then bagged, and the instruction sheets folded in, and the tiny printed sheets of waterslide transfers, the roundels, the squadron codes, the serial numbers, tucked alongside, all of it dropping into the polythene bags on their header cards. Elsewhere in the range, the boxed kits went through their own line, folded and glued and filled. A finished Airfix kit was a small marvel of coordination that no child ever thought about for a second. A dozen distinct industrial processes, from steel cutting to plastics chemistry to fine color printing, all converging on a bag that sold for the price of a comic. The margins were thin on any single kit. But Airfix didn't sell single kits. It sold them by the tens of millions, and that was the whole trick of it. And there was one more department, tucked away from the noise and the heat of the machinery, that mattered more to the brand than perhaps any other. The art studio. Because an Airfix kit was sold, above everything, by its box lid. A child standing at the Woolworths rack couldn't see the plastic inside the bag. What he saw was the painting on the header card. A Lancaster coming home on 3 engines with the 4th ablaze. A Junkers diving on a destroyer. A Spitfire banking hard against a summer sky. Those paintings were the shop window, the sales pitch, and, for a great many boys, the first real art they ever fell in love with. The whole operation had the confidence of a business that had stopped worrying about competitors. Airfix wasn't reacting to the market anymore. Airfix was the market. And in the studios and tool rooms and moulding halls of Wandsworth, through the long, warm, cheap oil middle of the 1960s and into the 1970s, everything worked. Everything simply worked. Chapter 5. The art gallery on the toy shop wall. The man who painted those box lids deserves his name spoken aloud, because for a generation of British children, he was, without their ever knowing it, their first favourite artist. Roy Cross painted the Airfix box art from 1964 to 1974. His first was a Dornier bomber, his last the cruiser Prinz Eugen, and in that decade he produced hundreds of the small, blazing dramas that defined the brand. He had trained as a technical illustrator at Fairey Aviation during the war, and he corresponded with the aerodynamicist who had helped shape the Spitfire's wing, so the aircraft he painted were not fantasies, but the real machines, rendered with an engineer's accuracy and a storyteller's fire. A child didn't buy a plastic Sterling bomber. He bought the moment on the lid, the bomber laden and lifting into a dawn sky, and then spent a wet Sunday afternoon trying to make the grey plastic in his hands live up to the painting in his head. He never quite managed it. Nobody ever quite managed it. And that small permanent gap between the glory on the box and the slightly wonky thing on the shelf was, in its way, the entire lesson of the hobby. Cross's paintings weren't decoration bolted on at the end. They were built into how the kit sold and how it was remembered. He worked from photographs and from his own deep technical knowledge, getting the light right, the weathering right, the drama right, a Junkers 88 diving on a destroyer, a Messerschmitt trailing smoke, a Lancaster limping home. Long after the plastic had been broken or lost or grown out of, the box art stayed in the memory, vivid as a stained glass window. For a great many British men now in their 60s and 70s, Roy Cross painted the first pictures they ever loved, and they never once knew his name. And here, we should be honest about what building an Airfix kit actually was, because the nostalgia has smoothed away the friction, and the friction was half the point. It was the tube of polystyrene cement, and the way too much of it fogged the clear canopy you'd been so careful with. It was the tiny tinlets of Humbrol enamel paint, with their stubborn lids and their skin that formed if you left them open. It was the transfers, the waterslide decals, that you soaked in a saucer and slid into place with a held breath, and that tore, or folded, or drifted off, centre and dried wrong. It was the undercarriage leg that snapped, the part that pinged off under the sideboard never to be seen again. The finished model proudly hung from the ceiling on a length of cotton, turning slowly in the draught. It was, for millions of boys across the length of Britain, the exact texture of childhood, and the smell of that polystyrene cement, more than any photograph, is what carries them straight back. By the middle of the 1970s, the scale of it had become almost difficult to believe. Airfix commanded 75% of the entire British kit market. 3 kits in every 4 sold under its name. It was turning out 20 million kits a year, releasing as many as 17 brand new subjects annually. Its range sprawling across aircraft and ships and tanks and cars and motorbikes and rockets and spacecraft and historical figures, from the Black Prince to a full set of Napoleonic soldiers, and, at one gloriously eccentric extreme, a life-size model of a garden robin. If a thing existed and could be moulded, Airfix had probably made it. or was about to. The mid-70s super kits, the great 1/24th scale Spitfire, big enough to fill a child's arms, and the Hurricane and the Harrier beside it, were showpieces, technical boasts, the work of a company with nothing left to prove and doing it anyway, for the sheer pleasure of showing what it could do. It had become part of the furniture of national life. Airfix magazine had been running since 1960, launched at £1, a monthly Bible for the hobby that reviewed the new kits and taught the finer arts. How to fill a seam, how to paint a camouflage scheme, how to weather an aircraft so it looked flown rather than fresh from the box. There was an Airfix Modelers Club, its membership stretching across the country, its president in the 1970s the television comedian Dick Emery. And the surest sign of all that a brand has conquered its world is that its name stops being a brand and quietly becomes a word. Just as any vacuum cleaner became a Hoover, and any vacuum flask a thermos, so any plastic construction kit at all, whoever had actually made it, wherever it came from, became, in ordinary British speech, an Airfix kit. The company had achieved the thing every business dreams of, and almost none ever reaches. It had become the name for the thing itself. This was the world at its warmest. A working-class hobby a father and son could share over a kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. The newspaper spread out to catch the glue. A shilling magazine, a 2-shilling kit, a bedroom shelf filling slowly with a scaled-down Air Force, each aeroplane the record of a weekend and a small private triumph. Boys who couldn't afford much of anything else could, for the price of a bag of sweets, own a Lancaster. It democratized something that had always belonged to the wealthy, the scale model, the miniature world, and handed it to everyone. A company that had grown from combs and inflatables into the undisputed king of a market it had very nearly invented. And standing at the top of it all, a refugee navigator who had turned the war he flew in into the best-loved toy in Britain, sold from a rack in Woolworths to the children of the men he'd fought alongside. It could not have looked more secure, which is exactly the moment these stories always choose. Chapter 6. The Summit. By the early 1970s, Airfix wasn't merely successful, it was expansive. It was confident in the particular way that only real, sustained success allows, the confidence that starts to feel like invincibility. And Ralph Ehrman was living the part. He was commuting to America by Concorde. He was building a house in Corfu. The man who had arrived in Britain as a refugee now moved through the world like someone for whom the hard part was over. Airfix had become far more than a kit company. It was now Airfix Industries, a sprawling conglomerate with fingers everywhere. Homewares under the crayon name, foam plastics, moulded tableware, games, dolls, crafts, a whole federation of plastic-based businesses gathered under one roof. The kits were still the jewel in it, still hugely, reliably profitable. But the company around the kits was growing wider and heavier and more complicated with every passing year, and a conglomerate is only ever as strong as its weakest division, because they all draw on the same bank, the same cash, the same nerve. And then, in 1971, came the decision that this entire story turns upon. One of the great names of British toy-making had just died. Lines Bros, the company behind the Triang brand, had once been, at its very height, the biggest toy manufacturer in the whole world. Now it had collapsed, going under with a record loss that shocked the trade. And out of the wreckage, one particular prize came onto the market. Meccano, the company that Frank Hornby had founded back in 1901, a name woven into the childhoods of Britons for 70 years. The maker of dinky die-cast cars and of Meccano itself, that ancestral British construction toy of perforated metal strips and little brass bolts and spanners. The thing that had taught engineers their first lessons in how the world bolted together, all of it made in its famous, aging factory on Binns Road in Liverpool. Two of the most beloved names in the history of British toys, going cheap out of a rival's grave. To Ehrman and the Airfix board, to men like the managing director David Sinigalia, it must have looked less like a gamble than a coronation. For a reported sum of around £2,740,000, Airfix bought Meccano and Dinky, and with that purchase, Airfix became the largest toy company in the whole of Britain. It looked like the Summit. Airfix had risen from a Hungarian refugee's comb factory to the king of model kits, and now it had bought up the fallen royalty of British toy-making and set them beside its crown. The market was theirs. The great names were theirs. The confidence was total. But the thing they had bought was not a jewel. The factory on Binns Road was old. Parts of it, one member of Parliament would later say, belonged in a museum rather than a modern production line. Its products were dated, and it was about to start losing money on a scale that would eventually drag everything down with it. The profitable kits, the studios, the tool rooms, the whole warm kingdom of hot polystyrene. Standing at that summit in the early 1970s, buying its dead rivals, commuting by Concorde, nobody inside Airfix could see the ground beginning to move. The oil that made the plastic was about to become a weapon. The pound was about to turn on them, and the great prize they had just carried home in triumph was about to reveal itself as a weight. The highest point, the last clear view, before the fall. Chapter 7. The weather changes. The first thing to go wrong came from a very long way away and had nothing to do with toys. In October 1973, war in the Middle East and the oil embargo that followed sent the price of crude oil climbing and then soaring. For most of British industry, this was a blow. For Airfix, it was something closer to a threat aimed at the very heart of the business, because every kit the company had ever made was at bottom made of oil. Polystyrene is an oil derivative. The grey plastic of every Spitfire, every Lancaster, every Golden Hind came out of the same barrel that was now doubling and trebling in price. The cheap energy years that had built the empire were over, and nobody had thought to tell the empire. The maths was cruel in its simplicity. The margin on a bagged kit had always been thin. Airfix made its money on volume, on shifting 20 million of something, rather than a fortune on any single one. So, when the cost of the raw material leapt, there was nowhere to hide it. Prices had to rise, and a hobby built entirely on pocket money cannot survive its prices rising without changing who it belongs to. The 2-shilling kit had been a kind of promise, that any child, however little he had, could own a piece of the war. As the price crept upward through the 70s, that promise quietly broke. The kits didn't get worse. They got dearer, and the children, the ones with a shilling or two and no more, began to thin out. What remained, more and more, were the serious adult enthusiasts, the men who had grown up on Airfix and had wages of their own now, who wanted finer detail and would pay for it. It was a subtle shift, and a fatal one. A pocket money hobby is a vast hobby. An enthusiast's hobby is a small one. Airfix was aging along with its first customers, and an aging hobby is a shrinking one. The 2 shillings that had once bought a Spitfire was a memory now. By the late 70s, a decent kit cost real money, and the paints and the glue and the brushes on top of it, so that the cheapest hobby in Britain was quietly becoming something a family had to weigh up. Nothing dramatic happened. No single price rise broke it. It was just that, penny by penny and year by year, the door that had once stood open to every child in the country was being pushed slowly shut. For a while, none of this showed on the surface, and that is the strange cruelty of an early decline. To a boy standing at the Woolworths rack in 1975, Airfix looked exactly as invincible as it had ever been. The company was still putting out showpiece kits, the great 1/24th scale Spitfire, big enough to fill a child's outstretched arms, a technical boast no rival could touch. The catalogue was still enormous. The name was still the word for the thing itself. A business does not decline the way a light switches off. It declines the way a tide goes out, so slowly that from the beach you'd swear the water hadn't moved, until one day you look up and the boats are sitting on the mud. And the competition, sensing the change in the water, pressed in. Matchbox had launched its own kits in 1973, in coloured plastic that needed no paint at all, aimed squarely at the very customer Airfix was losing, the casual child who wanted a quick result on a wet afternoon, rather than an apprenticeship in enamel and cement. Airfix still made the better kit, but the better kit is not always the one a distracted 10-year-old reaches for, and for the first time in a generation, Airfix found itself having to fight for children it had once simply owned. The first real tremor, though, showed in the art studio. Roy Cross, whose blazing box lids had sold the kits to a generation, found his commissions drying up after 1973. Fewer new kits meant fewer new paintings, and the rising cost of plastic meant fewer new kits. By 1974, he had gone. The most visible glory of the Golden Age was the first thing the crisis quietly took, and almost nobody noticed. because the boxes already on the shelves still blazed, and Cross's paintings didn't stop being beautiful just because no new ones were coming. In time, the art itself would change. The drama drained out of the boxes. The burning bombers and diving fighters gave way to flatter, safer photographs of the finished model. The gallery on the toy shop wall was closing, one lid at a time. Every part of the operation felt the squeeze. A new kit, remember, began in the tool room, with weeks of a skilled man's labour cut into a block of steel that now cost more than ever to buy and to machine. When money is tight, the tooling is the first thing a company postpones, and a kit maker that stops cutting new moulds is a kit maker slowly living off its past. The range that had once grown by as many as 17 new subjects a year began to thin. Airfix started, without ever quite admitting it, to coast. Then the rest of the decade arrived, and it was hard on everyone. Inflation ran through the British economy like a fever, wages and prices chasing each other upward. In the winter of 1974, the 3-day week dimmed the lights of the country's factories, Airfix among them, and beneath it all, something slower and more final was shifting. The children of the late 70s had new things to spend their money on. Electronic toys that beeped and flashed, the television on all evening now, and glowing in the arcades and creeping toward the front room, the very first video games. Space invaders marching down the screen, swallowing the 10-pence pieces that might once have bought half a kit. A boy who'd have spent a wet Sunday with a tube of cement and a Humbrol tin could now spend it in front of a screen. And, increasingly, he did. The world that had made Airfix was, gently and without any malice at all, moving on without it. The company might still have weathered all of this. At its core, it remained profitable. The kits still sold in their millions. But Airfix was no longer just a kit company. It was a conglomerate now, and somewhere inside it sat the thing it had carried home in triumph in 1971, the thing that was about to start costing it more than anyone had dared to imagine. Chapter 8. The Wait. Meccano did not fail suddenly. It failed the way these things usually fail, slowly, expensively, and in full view of people who kept hoping the next year would be better. To understand why Airfix could not simply cut it loose, you have to go back into the room where the decision was made, and remember how reasonable it had all seemed. In 1971, Ralph Ehrman and his board, the managing director David Sinigaglia, the director J.D. Goldhill, and the rest, had looked at the wreckage of Lines Bros and seen not a warning, but an opportunity. Two of the most beloved names in the history of British toys, Meccano and Dinky, going cheap out of a rival's grave. Buying them made Airfix the largest toy company in Britain overnight. It was the act of a firm that believed its own strength was permanent, and in 1971 there was every reason to believe it. This is the thing about the fatal decisions in these stories. They are almost never mad. They are the confident decisions of clever people at the very top of their game. And that is precisely what makes them fatal, because a confident company does not hedge. What they had actually bought was not a jewel, but a patient. The factory on Binns Road in Liverpool had been the pride of British toy-making for the better part of a century, and by the mid-1970s, it was something else. Its machinery was old. Some of it was very old. One member of Parliament would later remark, without much exaggeration, that parts of the plant belonged in a museum rather than on a modern production line. Labour relations were strained, and the products, once the wonders of the age, had been overtaken. The trouble ran deeper than tired machinery. Dinky, the die-cast side of the business, had once owned the market for miniature cars, and had then watched a rival called Corgi seize that market by giving its models opening doors and windows that actually glazed, while Matchbox took the rest by being smaller and cheaper. Dinky had been beaten on quality at the top and on price at the bottom, the worst place a product can find itself. And Meccano, the metal construction sets that had taught British boys the principles of engineering for 70 years, was now asking those same boys to sit and bolt together a crane from a printed diagram, while a television glowed in the corner and a video game waited down the road. The world had not stopped needing what Meccano taught. It had simply stopped wanting to learn it that way. And from 1974 onward, the whole enterprise lost money. Not for one bad year, but steadily, the losses growing rather than shrinking, until the sums stopped sounding like a struggling division and started sounding like a sickness. Now, This is the moment when a cautious company sells, cuts the loss, takes the lesson, walks away. Airfix did the opposite. It reached for another drowning man. In 1975, with the help of government money, Airfix took on yet another failing British toy maker, Triang Pedigree of Merthyr Tydfil, in the South Wales valleys. Triang Pedigree made dolls and prams, and it made them in a town that had already been bled white by the long retreat of coal and iron from the valleys. When Airfix arrived, backed by public subsidy, to keep the factory open, it was greeted as a reprieve. But a reprieve is not a cure. The dolls sold no better under Airfix than they had before. The subsidy ran its course, and within 2 years, the receivers were at the door. By 1977, Triang Pedigree was gone. For the second time in the decade, Airfix had spent money and hope on a rescue that failed, and this time it had done so with the people of a struggling Welsh town, watching and losing alongside it. It should have been the clearest possible signal that buying the wreckage of the toy trade was not a way of gaining strength, but a way of importing other companies' problems straight into your own accounts. The signal was not heard. Or perhaps it was heard, and a company this committed to the strategy simply could not afford to believe it. Meccano itself came within a breath of closing in 1977 and was kept alive only by the taxpayer, the best part of £1 million in temporary employment subsidy alone. Public money poured in to hold off a day everyone could already see coming. And around all of this, the conglomerate went on spreading itself ever thinner. Airfix Industries by now was a federation of plastic-based businesses. The Crayon Homewares range, the Declon Foam operation, Airflow Housewares, moulded tableware, games, dolls, crafts. Each division carried its own troubles and its own appetites, and each drew on the same central well of cash. This is the part that turns a bad purchase into a fatal structure. In a conglomerate, the parts are not sealed off from one another. They share a bank, a balance sheet, a line of credit, and a nerve. And so the losses at Binns Road were never Binns Road's problem alone. They were the profitable kit division's problem too, drawn quietly out of the same account, month after month, whether the men in Wandsworth knew it or not. The healthiest business in the group was being bled to keep the sickest one breathing, and the men making the Spitfires had no more say in it than the tide. It would be easy from here to make Ralph Ehrman the villain of the piece, the man who grew greedy, bought the failing empire, and doomed the good one. It would be easy, and it would be false. Ehrman was not a fool, and he was not a crook. He was a refugee who had flown against the Luftwaffe and then built a comb factory into a national institution, and who now found himself holding a great, complicated structure he could not put down. Selling Meccano meant admitting that the triumph of 1971 had been a mistake. Closing Binns Road meant throwing 1,000 loyal Liverpudlians onto the dole in a city that had precious little else to offer them. Every reasonable human instinct said, hold on a little longer, find the turnaround, protect the jobs. And every quarter he held on, the weight grew heavier. There is a bleak symmetry in the timing. Only a few years earlier, Ehrman had been commuting to America by Concorde and building a house in Corfu, the very picture of a man who had won. Now he was presiding over a slow, grinding effort to hold a collapsing federation together, selling the strong to prop up the weak, watching the empire he had built spend itself keeping alive the empire he had bought. By the end of the 1970s, the well was running low, and the wider world was turning savage. A new government came to power in 1979, committed to high interest rates and a hard line on subsidy. Money became expensive to borrow at exactly the moment a stretched conglomerate most needed it to be cheap, and the pound began to climb, a surge that would carry sterling from around $1.50 toward well over $2. It is hard to overstate how directly this struck a company like Airfix. A kit maker that sent a great share of its output abroad lived or died on the exchange rate, and the rate had just moved against it by the worst margin in living memory. An American hobby shop that had happily stocked British kits found the same kit now costing it half as much again, and reached instead for a revel or a monogram made at home. A German distributor did his sums and cut his order. Sales abroad did not decline gently, they fell off a shelf, and every pound of export income lost was a pound the group could no longer use to cover the losses still pouring out of Liverpool. The weight was already there. Now the storm had arrived to meet it, and the two together were about to do what neither could have managed alone. Chapter 9. 15 minutes. It ended for Binns Road on a Friday afternoon. Picture it. A Friday, the end of the shift in sight, the machines running as they had run for a lifetime. Then the word passing bench to bench that there was to be a meeting, and at the meeting, a man in a suit saying the thing that could not be unsaid. There would be no more work. Not next week, not ever. The man was Ray McNeice, the managing director of Meccano. The date was the 30th of November, 1979, and some 950 people were given roughly 15 minutes' notice that their working lives were over. Many of them had given the place 30 years. Some had given 40. It was 3 weeks before Christmas. For a woman who had walked through those gates every working morning since she was a girl, the factory was never simply a job. It was where she had spent her life, where she had made her friends, where some of them had met the men they married. The wage that came out of Binns Road was the wage that had raised their children. 15 minutes' notice to close all of that. McNeice did not dress it up. "We have run out of money," he said. "It's as simple as that. We had hoped for more money from Airfix, but we knew at about 3 o'clock yesterday that we weren't going to get it." He spoke of £5 million of losses over 3.5 years, and £1 million more in the current year alone. The numbers were true. They were also to a woman told to collect her things after 4 decades at the same bench, entirely beside the point. They did not go quietly. That same afternoon, the workforce, most of them women, occupied the factory. They simply refused to leave. They would fight this, one of them said, to the bitter end. What followed was a sit-in that lasted 14 weeks, through one of the coldest winters anyone could remember. The women of Binns Road held the factory against the receivers, against the courts, against the weather itself. On Christmas Eve, the heat was cut off. So was the light. So were the telephones. And so they brought in torches and portable heaters and a generator, and they stayed. They drew up rotors. They kept the place occupied around the clock, week after freezing week. Word went round Liverpool, and Liverpool answered the way it does. Food arrived at the gates. Other trade unionists came to stand with them. Families brought blankets and flasks, and children who did their homework by torchlight in a cold factory while their mothers held the line. Through that bitter winter, the occupation of Binns Road became something more than an industrial dispute. It became a point of principle for a whole city that had watched too much work walk out through too many gates and had decided that this time, at least, it would not go without a fight. They had names, these people, and the names matter, because the men who made the decisions had names too, and history usually remembers only the one set. The shop stewards, Mike Egan and John Lynch, led the occupation. A union man named Eric Titterington kept spirits up through the long, dark weeks. 2 local members of Parliament took up the fight and would not let it go. Eric Ogden and David Alton, carrying Binns Road into the House of Commons and refusing to let it become a footnote. Even the new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, acknowledged that Airfix could face prosecution for failing to give the 90 days' notice the law plainly required. And there was one detail that turned a hard closure into something colder. Eric Ogden discovered that his own official letters written to his constituents, the Meccano workers, were being intercepted and held back by the company's management. It took the head postmaster of Liverpool to step in and see that a member of Parliament's post reached the people it was addressed to. A firm that would do such a thing had, somewhere along the way, stopped seeing the workers as people at all. In the Commons in the middle of December, Ogden did not spare the managers. He condemned them for announcing, in what he called an action of almost incredible ineptitude and bad judgment, the closure of the works at less than 1 hour's notice. The minister rose and confirmed the figure for the record. 943 jobs. Gone. It could not last, and it didn't. On the 11th of March 1980, armed with a possession order from the High Court, the bailiffs came. 30 police came with them. The women who had held the factory for 14 weeks through the coldest winter in memory were carried and coaxed and cleared out into the Liverpool morning. By then, 700 had already accepted their redundancy and gone home to a city with nothing to offer them. 70 years of Meccano. Frank Hornby's factory. The doors locked behind them for the last time. There had always been a suspicion among the workers, never quite put to rest, that Ehrman had wanted the Meccano name more than the Meccano factory, that the plan, from early on, had been to move the making somewhere cheaper. His asking price for the rights was said to be over £5.5 million. The unions reckoned the true value nearer 1.25. Whatever the truth of it, the outcome was beyond dispute. The oldest name in British toy-making had been switched off in an afternoon. The weight had done its work on Meccano. Now it turned on everything else. Through 1980, under pressure from its banks, Airfix was forced to do the thing a healthy company never has to do. It began selling its most profitable businesses, not the failing ones, the successful ones, simply to raise the cash to pay the people it owed. That is the unmistakable signature of a company being eaten from the inside. You sell what makes money to cover what loses it, and each sale leaves you weaker than the last, and closer to the end. Down in Wandsworth, the men and women who made the kits had done nothing wrong. Their division made money. Their kits still sold 20 million a year. The tool makers, the moulders, the women who bagged the sprues and folded the instruction sheets, none of them had made a single bad decision. And it would not save one of their jobs because the accounts that governed their future had nothing to do with the quality of their work. For a few months more, the group staggered on. But a company selling its best assets to pay its debts is a company running downhill, and there is only ever one place that road ends. In January 1981, Airfix Industries called in the receivers. The whole of it, the combs, the inflatables, the Spitfire, the empire that had once commanded 3/4 of a market, was over. Not because the kits had stopped selling, they never stopped selling, but because they had been bolted to a structure that could no longer bear its own weight, and when the structure came down, it took the healthy parts with it. Chapter 10. The tooling goes to Calais. There was, at the very end, a proposal from the people who understood the business best. A management buyout. An attempt to keep Airfix in the hands of the men and women who actually knew how it worked, who understood the tooling, the range, the strange particular business of turning oil into childhood. It was turned down. The receivers had a different buyer in mind. The buyout would have kept the knowledge in the country. General Mills, the American food giant that took the prize instead, through its British toy subsidiary Palitoy, understood none of that. It understood brands and balance sheets, but a receiver's duty is to the creditors, not to the craft, and the American offer was the one that paid. So the knowledge walked out of the door with the men who carried it, and much of it was never gathered up again. The Airfix kit range, the railway range, even Meccano and Dinky all passed to Palitoy, at Colville, in Leicestershire. The archives went with them, and the tooling, the precious steel moulds, the hand-cut heart of the whole enterprise, the thing that had cost more than houses to create, was crated up and shipped out of Wandsworth, across the Channel, to a General Mills factory in Calais. Consider what that meant. The moulds for the Spitfire, the aeroplane that won the Battle of Britain, sold to British children by a refugee who had flown against the men who built the real ones, were loaded onto lorries and driven to France. The factory at Haldane Place fell quiet. The machines that had filled British bedrooms with a scaled-down air force stopped, and this time they did not start again. By 1982, Airfix Industries was formally wound up. The remaining pieces were parcelled out. The plastics and foam businesses went to a firm called Meccano, and the name of Nicholas Covey's company, 43 years after a Hungarian refugee had founded it to sit at the top of the trade directories, ceased to belong to anything at all. As for the people, they scattered the way workforces always scatter. The older hands into an early retirement they had not chosen, the younger into whatever a recession-bound Britain could offer, which in 1981 was not much, and the toolmakers, those quiet aristocrats of the trade whose skill had taken decades to build, carried that skill away into other industries, or simply into memory. A craft that cannot find work does not survive a generation. It just stops being passed on. The kits themselves, mercifully, did not die. They were too good and too loved to be allowed to. But the years that followed were a long exile, and a hard one. Under its new owners, Airfix survived without flourishing. The catalogue shrank, and for a while the famous box art gave way entirely to those flat photographs of grey plastic against a plain background. The low point, enthusiasts would later call it, when the brand seemed to have forgotten what it was for. Ownership drifted from hand to hand and country to country. From General Mills, the brand passed in the mid-1980s to Humbrol, the paint company, fittingly, whose little enamel tins had sat beside every kit ever built, and Humbrol moved the moulding again to a factory called Hella at Troon in France. In the 1990s, it changed hands once more to an Irish firm. And then, in 2006, Humbrol itself collapsed into administration, brought down in large part by the failure of that very French factory it had come to depend on. Most of its staff lost their jobs. For a few weeks that autumn, it looked as though the Airfix Spitfire might finally be gone for good. The brand that had outlasted the war, the austerity, the oil shock, and its own parents' bankruptcy, snuffed out at last by a supply chain stretched too thin across the sea, and the places emptied, one by one. The great works at Haldane Place in Wandsworth is offices now, a business centre by the river, refurbished and let, where marketing agencies and small firms work at desks above the ground where the moulding machines once ran. There is nothing there to tell you what happened. A later Airfix factory, up at Marfleet in Hull, was demolished in 2008, the ground swept flat. Much of Roycross's original artwork, those blazing paintings that were the first real art a whole generation ever loved, was simply destroyed along the way, thrown out as the company changed hands and nobody thought it worth the keeping. The moulds scattered across 2 countries, a child's Spitfire and the entire vanished civilization of skill that made it, reduced to a line in a receiver's ledger and a smell that a few aging men can still, if they shut their eyes, bring back in complete and aching detail. Chapter 11. What remains? And yet, in 2006, in the very same autumn that Humbrol went under, a model railway company from Kent stepped in and bought what was left. Hornby, and here the story folds back on itself in a way almost too neat to believe, because Hornby traced its own line straight back to Frank Hornby, the very man who had invented Meccano more than a century before. The name that Airfix had bought in triumph and lost in ruin now, in a sense, came round to rescue the rescuer. Hornby paid a couple of £1 million for Airfix and Humbrol together and brought the Spitfire home. Its chief executive called them exactly what they had always been: iconic. The kits are designed in Britain now and moulded largely in India, and the old range has been reissued under the name Vintage Classics, with Roycross's surviving paintings back on the lids, where they had always belonged. The brand outlived its own bankruptcy. It is older today than it was on the day it collapsed. And then there is the Spitfire in the hangar. In 2009, the television presenter James May set out to build the largest Airfix kit ever attempted, a full-size Supermarine Spitfire at 1:1 scale, assembled over 3 days by a team of schoolchildren in a hangar at the Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford. It stands there to this day, and here is the detail that makes it perfect, the small final grace note of the whole story. They gave it the squadron markings copied faithfully from the original 1953 kit. The wrong markings. The very error that had once prompted those first indignant complaint letters, and the hiring of a young modeller named John Edwards, more than half a century before. The mistake is part of it now, preserved forever, at full size, in a national museum. Because the kit was never really about being correct. It was about a father and a son at a kitchen table, the newspaper spread to catch the glue, and a small grey aeroplane taking shape under a child's own hands. It is tempting to say that one decision destroyed Airfix, that a proud company grew greedy, bought a dying rival, and was dragged under by its debts. It makes a tidy story, and it is not quite a lie. Meccano was the heaviest single thing Airfix ever picked up, and it never should have picked it up. But the truth is heavier and sadder than any one mistake. It was the weight of Meccano, yes, and also the oil that caught fire in 1973, and the pound that turned on its own exporters, and the recession, and the video games in the arcades, and a hobby quietly aging out of the pocket money world that had made it, and a habit of rescuing the drowning right up until the rescuer went down too. No single hand pushed Airfix off the cliff. It walked there, one reasonable step at a time, along a path that looked at every stage like the sensible way forward. What remains, in the end, is the plastic. Somewhere in Britain tonight, in an attic or a display cabinet or on a shelf in a spare room, there are millions of small grey aeroplanes built by hands that are older now, or stilled. They are chipped. The transfers have yellowed and lifted at the corners. The cotton they once hung from has long since been thrown away. But they are still here. The empire fell. The factory is offices. The men who cut the steel are mostly beneath the ground it stood on. And still, on 1,000 quiet shelves across the country, the little Spitfires hold their shape, the last patient proof of a place that once taught its children how the world was made, by handing them the pieces and trusting them to build it themselves.